China has just announced a major nationwide easing of its zero COVID policy, a week after protests against the controls spread across the country. People with mild COVID will no longer be forced into centralised quarantine facilities. They can recover at home instead. PCR tests will no longer be required to enter public buildings apart from schools and hospitals. China's leader Xi Jinping hasn't spoken publicly about the changes, but the goal of returning to zero infections after each outbreak appears to have been dropped. Our correspondent in Beijing, Stephen McDonnell, has more.
The speed with which the zero COVID systems which had been in place are now being dismantled has taken everybody by surprise here. Now, there still are some restrictions, and there may even still be lockdowns, but major planks have been removed. Now, these latest announcements include that you no longer have to go to a centralised quarantine facility if you catch COVID. You can stay at home. Also, no more PCR tests for entering buildings except for, say, schools and hospitals. And travel inside China is being eased up. So you previously needed these special permissions to go from province to province. That's also all going to go. Just last week, all this stuff was in place, and it seemed like the government was going to try and ride this out despite the protests. But I think those vocal demonstrations in many cities across the country were just too much for the government to bear. They realised just how unhappy the population here had been in terms of just enduring more and more of these COVID restrictions.
Stephen McDonnell, well, let's talk to Steve Tsang, who's director of the China Institute at SOAS here in London. Steve Tsang, what do you make, first of all, of the timing of this?
Well, the timing of it will suggest quite clearly that this is part of the coordinated responses to the protests that happened a bit over a week ago. The Chinese government will deny that, and they will say that this is because the situation's changed, that COVID changed. But reality is that when the protests happened first in Shanghai, calling for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to step down, it raised an alarm bell in Beijing. So they responded first by repressing the protests, then intimidating people using digital technology, and now finally removing some of the most egregious restrictions that caused people to be so angry to begin with.
How surprising is it that the Chinese authorities acted, it appears to be, as a result of these protests?
I don't think it is surprising that Xi Jinping would act this way. He made it very clear when he became leader in 2012 that he would not stand for any kind of protests against him or the Communist Party. So his quick response was to be expected. And as usual with Xi Jinping being a populist, once he has repressed it, or in his words, restored order, then he will be trying to remove some of the causes that led to the protests against him to begin with.
I wonder what your thoughts are on why it took so long. The restrictions have been in place in a very punishing and brutal way for nearly 3 years. There has been so much discontent about them. Why did the authorities why did they wait till now, given the economic damage it also was doing?
Well, the zero COVID policy was a signature policy of Xi Jinping, and he saw it as a policy that demonstrated the superiority of the Chinese political system under his leadership compared to Western democracies. And therefore, nobody could really advise him to drop that policy. And of course, with the concentration of power in his hands, he was really no longer listening to what people were thinking in China and how much the zero COVID policy was causing substantial frustrations and anger. And of course, there was the reality that a lot of people in China thought that zero COVID would go after the 20th Party Congress last month. But of course, the zero COVID policy did not go, and it got worse. People got more angry, so he had to act.
And briefly, given that you say the zero COVID policy was a signature policy of Xi Jinping, how do you drop that policy without it looking like a climb down, like an admission of failure?
Well, officially, China has not ended the zero COVID policy. They just stopped mentioning it. And so far, the criticism of the Chinese government is being reoriented as criticism of the implementation of the policy and not of the policy itself. And now they are also changing the narrative of the policy by saying that Omicron is less serious illness than even the common flu. And therefore, the situation changed, the policy implementation is being improved, rather than admitting that they make a mistake.
Interesting stuff. It's Professor Steve Tsang from the China Institute at SOAS. Thank you very much for that major change we're talking about in China.